something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Today, Bryce Green and I are speaking with Dr. Assal Rad. She is the research director at the National Iranian American Council and the author of The State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran. Devil's Chess Club is part of the American Exception podcast. If you want to see this episode in its entirety, and if you want to have access to what is, in my opinion, the best podcast collection of deep political and historical analysis, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. The link is in the show notes. If you can afford it, please subscribe. With more subscribers, we can do more things. We have a number of items in the work, including a documentary based on my dissertation and book, American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State. We're also hoping to make a documentary film on the life and scholarship of Professor Peter Dale Scott, and we are working on finishing up a new volume of Peter Dale Scott essays, which also includes chapters co-authored by me and by Ben Howard. We need help to do this, so please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. Assal Rad, thank you so much for being with us today. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
And Bryce Green in Bloomington, you've taken time out of your grad studies and activism to join us, so great to have you here.
Always good to be here, Aaron.
Assal, I would like to ask you about, I'd like to start off by asking you about what you're most well known for, which is your helpful correction of the headlines, the New York Times, and I think other outlets as well, but I mostly remember the New York Times headlines that you correct regarding Israel-Palestine, and how you began to write these. So can you give us a little bit of a background into how you became fixated on this particular aspect and how pernicious it is? Because I think that you do a good job on these, and it's important that people should check these out and think about it. So how did you start doing this?
So, I mean, as a historian, I've always been interested in sort of how a story is told, right? You know, the adage of history is written by the victors concept. It's like, how are these stories being told? And then when it comes to Israel-Palestine specifically, but obviously the broader Middle East, the way that sort of the discourse in the West and the way that we understand events in the Middle East and our relationship to those events, there's a massive gap between the reality and what the perception is, right? So you get narratives, for instance, when an event like 9/11 happens, you get narratives of they hate us because of our freedom with absolutely zero understanding to contextualize what is happening, not to justify what is happening, but simply to understand it in order to avoid it happening again, right? Like it was always a question of understanding and why there's such a lack of basic information and knowledge on the part of the Western populace, right? Regular people. And the media plays a huge role in that. I mean, how people are informed, how the public is generally informed is not through formal education. And we could, you could criticize our formal education system, but it's less so even that and more the media, because most people are not going to be experts in any one field. Like I am naive to so many different things in the world. So how do I get my information? I get it through the media. I get it through the news. And when you're in the West, you're under this impression that we have this wonderful free press, all the information that we don't have propaganda. Our adversaries have propaganda. We have, we're getting reports of truth and fact, but there's a huge gap between what people know and what is the reality. I'll give you an example. A few months ago, there was a poll in the US that said half of Americans could not answer whether more Palestinians had been killed in Gaza than Israelis. And this was at a point in which the death toll in Gaza, and these are always conservative death tolls, was over 30,000 people. So how can you explain the fact that the public doesn't understand this basic? They just lack facts. And so it's the media diet that they have. And I get a lot of people who will say things like, well, nobody really reads the New York Times or nobody reads CNN or watches these programs. And that's just not true. Like, yes, there is social media. There's a lot of independent news. There's a lot of ways to get information. But first, there's a generation gap. There's a huge generation gap in how people are consuming media. Older generations are still, doing it the way they usually do, TV and, print news, or even online. They're still going to those main sources. And it really impacts the way that they think. And if we've seen a shift in the narrative in the US in the last year, it is only because we have social media. It is only because people have seen with their own eyes these horrifying images coming out of Gaza every day for nearly a year. Because if you just consumed mainstream media, you wouldn't know most of it. And so that's why I really became fixated on this idea of, well, what if people actually read normal headlines? What if it was more truthful and it wasn't intentionally framed in a way to always take responsibility away from Israel and sort of whitewash the laundry list of crimes that Israel has committed? Then people would have a very different idea. If they had to read every single day, Israel bombs a school with refugees, Palestinian refugees. If they read words like genocide, Palestine, occupation every day, then it would affect the way that they actually think about it. And that would be a more honest representation of what's happening.
Right. This is a part of this concept in media theory called framing and indexing. Right. You have all of these different narratives that are being thrown around in the information space, but the press, the legacy media, the CNNs, the New York Times, they choose to frame it in a way that, like you said, takes responsibility away from the key actors. In their coverage, they will omit things like that the U.S. could end the war at any second if it wanted to, and that one of those important facts that frames the coverage. But I'm curious, in your experience, dealing with the American media, the American press, versus the all of these other media environments, including the Israeli one, how has the environment compared between like the American media, the UK press, or the Israeli press, which I found to be in some cases more honest than the US press about what's going on?
I think that that's a correct observation in terms of the Israeli press being more honest. I mean, the Israeli press does, and it depends on, they also have, from Haaretz to more right-wing or centrist or different types of outlets, Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, similarly as we have like our media landscape in the US or in the West. What they are more honest about is their criticisms of Israel, of their government, right? There's still a very sort of nationalist stance in terms of the current war and how Palestinians are specifically treated. Although there are, you could look at someone like Gideon Levy and the fact that he is very, very good at writing about Palestinian life in a way that is not dehumanizing, which is what we see in the West. But overall, they're more honest because they're more critical of Netanyahu and the government in Israel. They're saying things like, if you compare, for instance, the ceasefire talks and the coverage in the US and in the West, the European countries do the same thing. The coverage has basically been whatever the US government says, which has been since May. The line has been, Israel has already agreed to a ceasefire. The obstacle is Hamas. We're working on a ceasefire agreement. Israel, this is Israel's ceasefire proposal. This is the line in the West, and it just gets repeated over and over again by the press. Now, if you were to be reading Israeli sources, you would see headlines almost on a daily basis that say hostage families blame Netanyahu. Netanyahu has been sabotaging the deal from day one. Netanyahu doesn't want an end to the war. Netanyahu added new parameters to the ceasefire deal, sabotaging it yet again. This happens over and over in Israeli media. You see none of it in Western media. So yeah, there's a huge discrepancy in that. And so what it tells you is what our media is doing is just repeating whatever our government officials are saying. which is the opposite, by the way, of a free press. The whole point of a free press is to challenge the state's narrative. That is allegedly the difference between Western free press and authoritarian state press, right? This is the distinction. Distinctions that are so important in the Western point of view that you see platforms, social media platforms, actually add, state-run media if it's a Chinese outlet or a Russian outlet or an Iranian outlet. But you don't see that on the US side because they're not state-run in theory. They are, they're corporate media. They're run, it's a for-profit industry. But the information that they're giving you, especially in foreign policy, is filtered through whatever the state says. So oftentimes you see US press sound like not only an American press release, but an Israeli press release, like state press release. So that's the distinction. On the Israeli side, they're actually somewhat challenging their own government. On the US side, not only are they not challenging the Israeli government, they're not challenging the US government.
Right, let me try to give a little. This might be a little long-winded as a preface to a question, but I hope that it makes some sense, because my specialty is U.S. imperialism and the deep state, not like the Alex Jones deep state, but the actual regime in the West. And there's two ways to think of the deep state, and I'll try to make both of them relevant to this conversation. The one of them is that the one version of the deep state is the clandestine world and its connections to oligarchic forces, like private wealth, essentially, in the United States. So I think for example, in the case of Iran, 1953, you could think of the CIA as being, part of the government, but also part of something different, something deeper. And when it came time to overthrow the government of Iran in 1953, the first real discussions about this were at places like the Council on Foreign Relations, which is really Wall Street's think tank. And then Allen Dulles was the president at the time, and then he's eventually the director of the CIA, and he leads this coup once Eisenhower takes office. Then Truman, who had been sort of on the offense, but they just kept planning for it anyway, because Allen Dulles and these other people, these CFR Wall Street people, wanted Mossadegh gone, and they had invited the Shah to Iran just a couple years earlier to speak about this huge infrastructure deal that was going to be struck, like the biggest in history, with U.S. companies, buying all these things in Iran and loaning them money for all these projects and so on. So you have that sort of deep state, like the dark clandestine part of working on behalf of corporate money. But the bigger thing is the regime. Like the deep state is sort of like the regime. And the reason it's not really the state or the regime, it's that what's really deep about it is that it has to be disguised and not admitted openly that this really isn't a democracy that follows the rule of law. It's really like an oligarchy that poses as a democracy. And so you need a deep state, a regime, to sort of make things go the way the top wants it to go. And so I guess what I'm saying is, if you consider that the same sort of oligarchs who direct foreign policy, who run the Council on Foreign Relations and all these other think tanks, I'm not trying to single them out, but they're a good example of it. If this is like oligarchic and we really have a more oligarchic regime, couldn't you say that the New York Times is basically regime media? I mean, in a pretty straightforward way. Like they don't respond or report in an objective way by the standards of journalism, as you point out all the time, and they don't respond to the majority of the U.S. public, who actually would like things like a ceasefire in Gaza. Even though they don't know that much about it, the majority still wants a ceasefire. So I guess this is, how much of a distinction is there between the regime media of like Russia or Iran and U.S. media when it comes down to it?
I mean, I think that's a great question and sort of a great setup to get to the layers of problem. And that's why I said it's our media it's not state funded, right? It's a corporate media. That doesn't mean, that still speaks to the limitations of what that media can do, because it is based on a for-profit industry within a capitalist state that is, to your point, basically an oligarchy, right? I mean, if we're being honest. One of the significant reasons why there's such a gap between policy and what people want. I mean, these are like basic questions to ask, but if you're in a democratic country, if a country is a democracy, and it's a representative democracy, meaning you vote for officials that are supposed to represent your will, right? That's the most basic concept within a democracy, the will of the people. And yet across the board, whether it's domestic or foreign policy, you get bipartisan majorities that want something and policies that do not match what the bipartisan majority wants. So what is there to explain this gap? That's the lobbying system, the amount of money that's being pumped into our electoral process, and the fact that elections in many ways are just being bought by special interests. And those special interests are related to, again, domestic and foreign policy. One thing that they share, sometimes there's ideological components to it, but one thing that they tend to share is profits. I mean, these are large industries, these are multi-billion-dollar industries. And so is it really a free press if you're answering to oligarchs or if you're answering to the state? So that there's a murky kind of space there. Since you brought up Iran and the coup of 53, I actually thought this is somehow related. I'm going to make it related. So one of the key events between the United States and Iran that causes a severing of relations and basically like paints the way that Americans think about Iran for the last 4.5 decades is the embassy seizure, right? The hostage crisis that starts in November of 1979. A lot of people might think it's the revolution itself. It's not. The revolution happens in February of 1979. The US does not sever relations with Iran. It's not until the US embassy is taken by Iranian students that formal diplomatic relations are severed, and they've never gone back since. Now, here's the history that's missing from that moment in 1979, and it's related to 1953. One of the genuine fears that existed within Iran was that the US embassy, much like it was used in 1953, would be a base to restore the Shah to power again, right? Another coup. And so if you look at when the embassy was seized, this was 2 weeks after the Shah was allowed to enter the United States for medical treatment. The Carter administration,
which Carter did not want to do.
This is the point that I was getting to.
Okay.
Exactly.
I'm sorry.
Carter did not
go ahead.
want to do it. Carter did not want to do it. And Carter understood at the time that it would put the US embassy at risk. So who are some of the people who are pressuring him to do it? Well, one is someone like Henry Kissinger. Another is Rockefeller.
Yeah,
right?
Kissinger was a Rockefeller man. I mean,
But Rockefeller had a relationship with the Shah as well, right?
Yes, he had all his money.
Tons of money, right? So these connections, as much as we don't think about them, are very often there. So what pressures basically Carter to let the Shah in are these moneyed interests that are saying, well, the Shah had powerful friends in the US.
Brzezinski too. Brzezinski is even more clearly the Rockefeller man because he co-founded the Trilateral Commission with him, and Carter was on that as well. So Brzezinski was a big actor, a very sinister actor there.
And to be clear, it wasn't just Carter. There were other members of the Carter administration who also did not want to let the Shah in for the same fear, which obviously came to pass.
Vance, right?
Yes,
Probably.
exactly. So, so when you look at these kinds of historic episodes, you see exactly the different strands that you brought up intersect and how policy is decided on. It wasn't sound policy for the US, but you have powerful people in powerful positions. That's what they want. That's what they get.
Yeah, I mean, I include the quote in my book even, or my dissertation, where Jimmy Carter, he throws up his hand because there's this huge lobbying thing. I think they even get Vance to defect in the end, eventually, if I recall. But Jimmy Carter, the quote from him was something like, "What are you going to do when they storm the embassy and take all of our people hostage?" You know, and it's going to make me look terrible. But he knows it's going to screw him, and he can't stop. He can't not do it. It's just such a perfect microcosm of our system.
Yeah, well, and if we want to just tack on a little bit of history to that, like, microcosm of the system, the fact that Carter loses the election and Reagan wins is in part due to that very crisis, which is extended by Reagan, right? By Reagan and another group of interests that want Reagan to be elected. And so that's why the hostages are kept for several extra months, and they are released the day Reagan is inaugurated to ensure that this does not that basically this crisis is not resolved by Carter before the election.
Yeah, I think if I recall, they're even released while he's being sworn in or something like that. It's even crazier.
I think so. Yeah, it's like, right. I mean, I'm pretty sure you're right that it's exactly, it's happening at the exact same time.
Yeah. Yeah. And more things have come out to confirm that over the years, and they just shrug. They're like, well, I guess the conspiracy theorists were right or something. Or I don't even know if they say that.
I think a few years ago, I think the New York Times published an article that was basically confirming all of the October surprise conspiracy theories. And, again, it was met with the shrug. But, that's the nature of the media system.
I think there's a new book. It's either out or coming out. I want to say it's called Den of Lies, but it's Den of Spies or Den of Lies. I can't remember because they also rhyme and they go together. But it is about this episode with Reagan and the hostages.
Right. I mean, it is amazing that we can't ever resolve those things.
It's Den of Spies confirmed.
Oh, cool. I have another thing to throw at you here while we're talking about this particular era, and this is kind of a pet hypothesis of mine, based on there's some basis for it, I think, and that is that did the U.S. intervene in some way during the sort of power vacuum after the revolution to make sure that it was Islamists who prevailed over more sort of nascent Nasserist type or Mossadegist type forces in Iran? Because I look back at that time period, and Brzezinski and these other people were all really manipulating political Islam at the time, as we see with Afghanistan and so on. But there were actually things they were doing even before that are relevant, like funding people like Hekmatyar, even before in the earlier in the 70s. Like they were really kind of building up this Islamism as a covert tool, which is a British Empire tradition too, with the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. Do you think it's possible that the U.S. deep political forces in the West, maybe the U.S., Britain, Israel, some mixture of those forces, intervene to make sure that it would be religious forces rather than more socialist? I don't want to call them socialist nationalists, but that's really kind of what Mossadegh would sort of represent, or Nasser. Like, do you think that the U.S. could have intervened to tip the scales? Not that they thought that the Ayatollah was going to be as harsh as he was, but that they just thought, you know what, for our purposes, it's better as long as they're not leftist nationalists of some kind, that it would be better. Have you ever thought about this, or what do you think?
So there's I don't want to get too deep into like a historical lesson of the time, but okay. So it's interesting that you bring that up, because it is actually the kind of historical conspiracy or counter history that Iranian diaspora opposition used in order to say that the revolution that happened in 1979 was not really a revolution. So there's this whole new history narrative within that opposition movement. And this is outside of the country that I'm specifically talking about. That sort of reverses 1953 and 1979. 1953 is treated as not a coup. It was not a coup. It was, in fact, the Shah was allowed to appoint and dismiss prime ministers at his will, which is an ironic point to make, because the entire point of Mossadegh and the argument that people make is that it was a democratization movement. And so the Shah should not be allowed to just dismiss and appoint prime ministers at will. But basically, like, the role of the US in the coup is dismissed. And 1979 is treated more like a US conspiracy to get rid of the Shah and to put in Islamists in power, right? And so that's why I'm being very careful to sort of disentangle the point that you're making. Now, what happens in the period leading up to the revolution, and I'm talking about decades, is when the Shah was politically repressive, the group he was most repressive towards were actually on the left. So the leftists, by the time of the revolution, in many ways were decimated, whether it was guerrilla forces on the left or just leftist parties, because that's really where his focus was. And so it allowed space for Islamists to have sort of more power, is the wrong word, but they had more space to work, if that makes sense, right? The mosque networks were a lot harder to shut down than the leftists were. And so by the time of the revolution, you don't have, I mean, the leftists still exist. I'm not saying they weren't there. They were certainly there. But not with the same presence that they could have had it not been suppressed for so long by the Shah and his secret police, the Sabak. Also, there were the secular nationalists, right? What I'm trying to get at is that the revolution, sometimes when you take these narratives into view, then the revolution undermines Iranian agency within it. And it was very much, I mean, the historical canon is very clear on the fact that this was a people's revolution in the sense that Iranians had agency. Now they had very different points of view across the political spectrum, agreed simply on the idea that the monarchy should be deposed and the monarch should be taken out. And so that's where you get an aftermath, right? A post-revolutionary era that creates conflicts. In its very early stage, there's an interim government in Iran, and that's established in February of 1979, that brings in these different parties, right? It's headed by, I believe it was Bazargan. It has, political prisoners are freed, and you sort of have this moment of maybe we can find a unity government. It's over the course of 1 or 2 years that the Islamic Republic Party, that is led by Khomeini and his inner circle, consolidate power and get rid of anyone else who might be a threat to their consolidation. Something else to take in mind, since we were talking about the hostage crisis, the Bazargan government, the one that was supposed to be a little bit more of a unity government, resigns in November because of the taking of the embassy. So under this new crisis, the government resigns, and by December, you have a constitution that's written that is the constitution of the Islamic Republic that you see today. So it's a little bit more complicated, I would say. And that might have been a very long-winded response. I said I didn't want to give a history lesson and then ended up doing it.
No, it's good.
We love history lessons here.
I appreciate that. I'll throw this out there as something for you to think about and investigate, because this isn't something I've delved in deeply to the actual Iranian aspect of it. However, what happens during Watergate is Richard Helms is running the CIA and Nixon fires him and he sends him to Iran. And in the aftermath of Watergate, I believe he's still the ambassador. And one of the things he does is set up a kind of, because the CIA is under suspicion because they're involved in Watergate, he sets up a sort of CIA outside of the CIA. He uses Iranian intelligence and some Egyptian and Pakistani and others, and he kind of cobbles together like his own little mini covert operations arm. And Helms is like one of the main people there, and he's in Iran. And so I've heard people speculate that it may not have been, say, Carter's CIA that did this, because that would have been, it really messed him up. But it could have been these other forces of that associated with that milieu of just Western-backed capitalism and intelligence operations. So I don't know if there's much there, but it is a very weird. The history is very strange of U.S. foreign policy and the clandestine side of it. I don't know what to make of it. I do find it strange that they sort of parachuted the Ayatollah from France into there. I don't mean literally, but you know what I mean. That he was like in Paris, and then it seems like he's such an anti-Western person. You think they might not have wanted him to go back to Iran, but they seem to have been fine with him going back to Iran. So what to make of that, I don't know, but something to think about.
Something else to keep in mind is the Shah had excellent relationships with the U.S., like an excellent relationship with the U.S. It had, under the monarchy, Iran had obviously not much better, but a good relationship with Israel, right? So part of the reasoning that would basically say, like, why would the U.S. even want to take out a figure like the Shah is the fact that this was like their guy in the region. He was extremely important. And actually that's why I said who he was fighting the most. Not only was he fighting or was he suppressing leftists in Iran, like Iranian leftists in the country, but he was also helping in terms of fighting, the Soviet Union and communism and other situations as well. So this was someone who was like a significant figure that served U.S. interests. And that's why I've seen that that theory is thrown around. So that's what I'm saying. It's not like that theory is thrown around that the Islamists come in to oppose communism, but the Shah was already doing that. So there was no reason to have to rely on this kind of figure, someone like Khomeini, to do it. And when you look at the history of the revolution itself, I mean, Khomeini becomes a significant figure in the early 1960s, and the Shah exiles him at that time. So, you know, but it is a theory. I'm telling you, it's a theory that's out there. It's just not part of the historic canon.
Oh yeah, and it couldn't be really, because if there was done this way, it's been done secretly. I don't.
Because the coup is, though, right? The coup is in the historic canon.
Oh yeah. That's very, and there's more and more on it. More has come out. I think it first started to come out in the 70s, and then Stephen Kinzer's book, All the Shah's Men, comes out later. But people basically knew some of these things. I think Miles Copeland and Kermit Roosevelt both talked about it earlier, and so it became known by people who followed that, but not very well known. To me, the suspicion is not about so much the revolution and getting rid of the Shah, is that did they attempt to mess with it and guide the way it was going to unfold, knowing that the Shah was like untenable as a reliable puppet anymore. But anyway. You can watch the rest of this episode by subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. There you will find the best coverage and analysis of the deep politics of the U.S. empire. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. It is also in the show notes. If you can afford it, please subscribe. You can also find in the show notes a link to purchase Assal Rad's important book, The State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran. Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. I greatly appreciated Assal Rad's perspective and expertise today. I applaud her and others like her who are doing important and essential work in the struggle to liberate humanity, including the people of the White West, from the lawless imperial regime that for the time being dominates international politics. She comes from a Persian or Iranian background. Maybe that gives her some insight into fundamental truths that the U.S. empire cannot grapple with. I think that Iranians likely have some cultural memory that the West lacks, because since Columbus, the world has not been able to overcome Western imperialism. Outside of Western consciousness, I believe that more people understand that no empire can win forever on the devil's chessboard.